There, yeah. Well, this show doesn't suck. This is Howl with Nick Beat, and you are listening to a piece by Mike Myers from the movie So I Married an Axe Murderer, and we've got a special show tonight. It's also being filmed by Kimberly Mallett Productions, and hope you are listening out there. If you want to call in to talk to any of our panelists tonight, the number is 416-946-7000. At any time during the show. This is Nick Beat. We're going to be back with our topic for tonight, which is poetry slams. Do they help or hurt poetry as an art form? And we'll be back with our three panelists in a minute. This is Nick Beat and Howl. Okay, well, that was the shortest minute in history. Wow. It's funny, the room was really tense for about 30 seconds. It was really interesting because we kind of got a little bit of the battle of the bards tonight. Poetry slams, poetry competitions. Are they good or bad for poetry? I'm your moderator, Nick Beat. Tonight's panelists are Luciano Iacobelli of Lyrical Miracle Press.
Iacobelli.
Iacobelli.
There's no J.
Molto bene. Iacobelli. And we also have, of course, an artist, writer, poet, Madison Shadwell.
Good evening.
And we have Mr. Poetry Slam himself, Toronto Poetry Slam host, founder, also editor at Digital Journal, and a poet in his own right. We have Dave Silverberg. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks for having me again, man.
It's good to have you back. And we've got this panel ostensibly to discuss specifically that very question. If you want to call in again and talk to our guests, or you have a position you want to take up with one of our guests, or on the actual question in question, call again, 416-946-7000. We'll be taking calls in about 5 minutes. Okay, we're going to start off with Luciano. Luciano, sort of, are you in the middle on this issue?
Yeah.
How do you feel about it?
Well, actually, I've got a connection to slam poet. I'm not a slam poet, but I've got a connection. I've published through Lyrical Miracle Press a couple of slam poets, David Silverberg being one, Valentino Senza being another. And then as a Quattro publisher with Quattro, my other company, we did a slam anthology, which Dave edited. Sold out.
I owe my entire publishing career to Luciano.
So and also when I owned Q Space Cafe, slams took place in the venue. So and I was there to witness a number of slams because I was serving wine and coffee and tea. So I got to experience the whole slam thing. So I'm involved. I was involved to some capacity in promoting slam. Now, the question, does the slam poetry contribute to poetry as an art form? And so I'm not going to give a definite yes or no on that. I would say that it's always a case of the individual poet. That there are some slam poets that I would consider as being poets I could pick up and read. It doesn't matter that they're slam. They are actually writing poetry. Then there's other slam poets, and I would say the bulk here, so don't take offense. I would say the bulk of them are not poets at all, but ranters or people who are just performing their feelings. I wouldn't call that poetry. So the short answer is it depends on the actual slam artist as to whether they are contributing to the art form of poetry or not. But I would say on the whole though that what passes for slam poetry I would not necessarily rank as poetry.
Okay.
I'd say only the exceptional piece, the exceptional poet, slam poet, I would consider a poet.
Okay. That's Luciano Iacobelli, or Iacobelli, I should say. Iacobelli.
Iacobelli, you gotta taste it, man.
Mucho Italiano. Vanzita. Anyway, I hope you're enjoying the show so far. As we have our guest panelists again. If you just joined us, it's Luciano Iacobelli. And we have Madison Shadwell, and we have Dave Silverberg, and we're taking calls within about 2 minutes. 416-946-7000 if you want to talk to our guests or address this issue. They have a long history. A lot of people don't know that poetry slams started a long, long time ago. The Irish tribal communities had it back in 900 AD. They would, instead of fighting each other, they would literally get poets from either side because there was a long tradition of bardic poetry by the chieftains, and they would have competitions that way. And also the Scandinavians, the same thing with the skalds, would have competitions. And there's a long history of it. But Dave, I wanted to ask you before we get to your position, poetry slams, where did they start? What are they?
Sure. Poetry slams began in Chicago when a construction worker named Mark Smith around 30 years ago decided that he wanted to make poetry a bit more exciting. He was seeing a lot of the same people at poetry readings, quiet candlelit rooms, berets, light finger snapping, and just this kind of politeness and non-energy that he felt was sapping poetry as an art form. So he created a tournament whereby poets would take the stage, perform their poetry, and randomly pick judges from the audience would score each poem between 0 to 10, and basing their judgment both on content and performance. So in the poet's mind, they had to perform their poem, but also has to be well written, and that's what the judges were basing their judgment on. Poetry slams then rocketed across the U.S. There's the National Poetry Slam right now, which is a national competition of spoken word slam teams that number around 72, so 72 cities from across North America converge in one city every year in the U.S., and there's now poetry slams, of course, across Canada, Italy, Singapore, Europe, and Brazil, I've been hearing too. So Poetry Slam is a competition, and I like to differentiate between the terms. There's spoken word happening at a Poetry Slam, but there's a lot of spoken word that is never uttered in a competitive way, that is done in a very different way. You can call the Four Horsemen spoken word as well, some Canadian legends who use sound poetry to perform their words in a very non-linear way. And Bill Bissett, a friend of ours that we know and love, and Robert Priest, another great poet in Toronto, trying to rat off the GTA poets to keep it local. And I would account these great poets as both literary and spoken word poets who can straddle that line, but they've never stepped onto the slam stage.
Okay, so what's the difference between spoken word poet? Is it the spoken word poet is not necessarily in a competition?
Right. Spoken word can occur at a poetry slam, and some people call slam poetry the art of creating poetry to win poetry slams or to perform solely at these competitions like we have at the Drake Hotel every 2 weeks.
Okay. What do you think of, before we get to Madison, what do you think of Luciano's more centrist position on it? How do you take it?
I don't think he's entirely wrong. I think poetry slams, by its definition, is a glorified open mic. You're allowing anyone to take the stage. They don't have to be known to you. They don't have to pre-register. They don't have to have a certain pedigree of talent. And that is going to invite people who've never read for the first time, people who are rappers, who want to try out some of their words a cappella, people who are in the drama and theater scene, who might not have any writing experience, but a lot of performance experience and want to try out a new monologue. So sometimes poetry slams are tryouts, are open mics, but the cream rises to the top, and by the third round, when the judges have decided who they enjoy most, you see some talent that I think rivals some of the best stuff we've seen at, let's say, the Harborfront Reading Series.
Okay. This is Nick Beat. If you just joined us, you just heard Dave Silverberg, our panelist Luciano Iacobelli, and of course Madison Shadwell. Madison, you wanted to, what's your position on it before we define what a poet actually is within the society that we're living in right now? What's your position?
I guess I'm the designated adversary in this particular situation. And I agree with both gentlemen thus far. They've both made some very valid points. Luciano, in regards to talking about how there are a lot of bad poets, though, that do show up at these things. I think what's important to discuss with that point is ultimately it's content. I think content has a lot to play with the situation, and that's where they're lacking. I think they don't know what to say.
Okay.
And again, part of that is due to also not having points of reference, literary points of reference. I've been to poetry slams and tried to get discussion going and asking people, who are some of your favorite poets. Normally they don't have a favorite poet or a favorite period, so they don't understand the literary heritage that I think genuine, authentic poets, realize that has to be there. I mean, at some point you have to compare yourself to the greats. And a lot of these events are just ultra subjective, and therefore objectivity is left at the door. So.
Okay.
And in regards to what you were saying, one thing is you were talking how a lot of actors show up and so on and so forth, and I think one of the problems that I have with poetry slams essentially is the fact that it's more theater, it's even more comedic, and it's not the performance on the stage that should move you, it's the words that should move you. So, those kind of attributes have a place already. You can go to a comedy club and deliver your material there, or you could act on stage, and I find that the line is blurred there, and that gets in the way sometimes of enjoying the events as well.
Dave?
Well, I would definitely say that a line that we have in our Poetry Slam anthem, that is the reading we do before we start every Poetry Slam, is that the best poet always loses. And it's tongue-in-cheek, but there's a lot of truth to it, meaning that the poet with the most beautiful lines, the most treasured metaphors, the kind of meter that surpasses a lot of the more performative aspects of other poets, doesn't always get, let's say, the highest scores or the recognition from the audience. So theatrics does work because we're at the Drake Hotel on a Saturday night, people are drinking, this is kind of what people want to see, sometimes the big, loud stuff.
But I think with poetry and readings in general, it's that you also want to cultivate the audience, and that's what creates a real genuine scene. So if the performers or poets aren't being received well, there's also a lack of historical memory in regards to the literary heritage in the audience's behalf, so they're not being cultivated. So in a way, the job of the poet is to relate the current cultural circumstances to the masses, and they need to be able to deliver that in a very structured way where there's discipline. I find that most of these things are very undisciplined, and that's how you can cultivate things.
Yeah, actually,
Let's take a call.
yeah, I want to sort of support you on a couple of the things that you've said. Actually, the problem with slam is the contest component at times, because what you're doing is you're competing and you're playing to an audience, right? Whereas I think the best poets have the audience play to them. The great writers, do not try to get the audience approval. The audience has to rise up to them. That never happens with slam poetry. Actually, a couple of times I've seen some challenging poets go up there, but the audience is generally stunned at it. They don't know how to react, and they don't win the contest because they're not accessible. Whereas a great poet sometimes, forces the audience, lifts the audience up with them. So that's something that doesn't occur in slam poetry. I'm also an educator, and I was a full-time teacher for the longest time and taught creative writing and poetry. And if somebody in one of my courses had discovered slam poetry before they discovered the other poets that you were talking about, there was no way to ever turn them back, to make them read T.S. Eliot or Wallace Stevens, because they believed, oh, that's all academic stuff. Or they use the word page poetry. They always had a term to denigrate the classics.
Yeah, we live in an anti-intellectual society.
And so they said, if it's not accessible, this would be the retort to me. If it's not accessible, it's not good. If you can't understand it, it's not good.
It should be challenging.
I'm going to disagree with one thing you said. There is too much content in slam poetry. It's all content.
It's
all message.
Yeah.
It's all message. It's all feeling. It's not really about the use of words. It's all about getting your heart out. And it's all content driven. And that's the other issue I have.
Okay.
Some of the slam.
You get far too much confessional poetry,
Oh,
It's
yeah.
it's far too confessional. It's overtly emotional. And what I'm saying and what I'm suggesting, and I'm not saying that the slams are, should be rid of, but maybe to get that under wraps. Again, it's the words. It's the power of the word. It's spoken word. It's the word.
Thanks for your call, Valentine. We actually got to move on to our next caller. Thanks so much for your input. Really appreciate it, Val. Cheers. Take care. Thank you.
I
Go ahead, George.
wanted to add something too, we're at an age in history where language is under the microscope, okay? And mostly because language in the past has been seductive. It's language that brought us into wars. It's language that's created all sorts of abuses and injustices. So the modern poet has an obligation, and that is to look at language. That is to put it under the microscope and make sure that language is not used as a tool of seduction. Slam is all about seduction. That's my objection to it, is that the poets aren't they're there to seduce the audience, to win the award. So it's already set up as seduction. And it's seduction also by giving the audience what it is they want to hear, in terms of all the politically correct angles, all the
Very good
issues,
point,
so
very
it's
good
seduction there. But the other seduction is that it's language that doesn't question itself. It's language at face value. And the best slam poets, of course, are the ones that do not use language at face value, but they are few and far between. And so, back to your original question, on the whole, does slam poetry contribute and add to the art? And it does both. It actually dissolves and dilutes the art of poetry,
It's like the pharmacon.
and it also, at the same time, can bring it up, depending on the poet.
It's what Derrida talked about, the pharmacon. It's both the poison and the cure simultaneously.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll have to hold on that thought and for Dave's reply to that. This is Nick Beat on CIUT at 9.5 FM on your dial. This is Howl, Spoken Word Show. Our topic tonight, poetry slams, do they help or hurt poetry as an art form? Rogers Cable 946 and Star Satellite channel 826. And this show will also be broadcast eventually on YouTube, and we're having it filmed by Kimberly Mallett. It'll be edited later by Penelope Smith. So hope you're enjoying the show. And if anybody wants to call and talk to our panelists, 416-946-7000. So yeah, okay. Luciano made an excellent point. We had a little bit of a commercial interruption. Dave, what would you say to what Luciano had made?
Sure, just to fill everyone in, Luciano said that the majority of slam poetry dilutes poetry as a whole. And I would say that spoken word and performance poetry has always been an offshoot of traditional literary or quote-unquote page poetry, what you heard from some of your students. It's almost as if you're comparing how dancehall might have diluted traditional reggae. It's apples and oranges. It's often said that poetry slam is a game. It's a trick to get people sitting in an audience to hear poetry / spoken word / performance poetry / someone's raps that he decided to make that morning. That suddenly gets everyone very, very excited. And I think sometimes people confuse poetry slam for something very, very serious or very devious, or something that's going to hurt poetry to its core and hamper the literary community's ability to get noticed or to elevate itself. But I really think spoken word is an evolution of a traditional art form that Nick mentioned has started with the Greeks and of course has evolved and passed into the Middle Ages and then to the 1960s beats to be something that people can relate to. And I wouldn't have been involved in Toronto Poetry Slam for 8 years if I didn't believe that it can transform people, it can make grown men cry within a span of 3 minutes, and that can encourage halls as big as Massey Hall to fill with people just coming to hear poetry. And I don't think we've had that sense of energy in a long time in the poetry community, at least within the more modern era.
Okay.
No one.
Go ahead,
yes,
Madison.
No one's questioning your, your passion and love for what you're doing. But you did make a point that's interesting that I'd like to touch upon, is the rap artist, or whatever spoken word artist, they say, I wrote this poem on the bus here. I wrote this poem this morning. I wrote this. I mean, there are lines that I have worked on for 7 or more years, just one single line. And very few people, I think, have the ability to run something significant off in that matter of time. I mean,
I would say it depends on the pedigree of the talent, but sometimes spoken word can have that umbrella that lets people perform no matter the background, no matter the either talent level or history of poetry that they might have not
but we
learned.
also, another point that I want to make is that we have to be weary of positivity for positivity's sake. That reinforcement, because some people, they just don't have the talent and ability, and there's never any critical analysis. Everyone's afraid to give critical analysis. And
That's
the
actually-
moment you do, the defense mechanisms seem to go up, and that also slides over into the
But
poetry
actually, the
meetings
real
as well.
reason that Poetry Slam became so popular is that it allows the audience to have a say in the art form. And that's something that a lot of people don't understand, is that the audience is encouraged to boo, to hiss, to let the artist know when they like a certain line, when they like a certain metaphor. So the audience is very much not sitting on their heels or not vocalizing how they're feeling about poetry, and there's almost instant feedback that a poet gets, whether a certain line or a certain poem or a certain phrasing resonates with the audience, and they can either take that with a grain of salt and say, you know, that's just a sampling of the audience, that's not a judgment on my poetry, or they can say, hey, maybe that rhyme scheme didn't flow so well, maybe that line didn't hit as well as I thought it would and didn't have that impact because the audience weren't reacting.
But
And it's hard
so
to get
you're
that reaction.
telling me that the slam poet, from a boo or a hiss, is able to get that kind of articulation?
Yes, very, very much so, and they can actually.
I
I felt
have to
it.
argue that I don't believe that that's the
Actually,
case.
I felt it myself,
the point that I
anytime.
made before the commercial break was the point about seduction.
Mhm.
That I said we're at an age where we have to look at how language seduces us, because it's led us up some blind alleys, right? It's led us up. So, but the slam poet, all they seem to be doing is seducing. There's no critical stance in regard to the language that they use. They're not stepping back and observing it. They're not questioning it. They're not putting it under the microscope. Another observation I made with the slam audience is that they don't buy books. They do not buy books. I think you may have had this thing, which makes me wonder just, well, how much are they actually promoting poetry if they're not buying books, they're not reading it? They go to the slam and then they go home.
How do you know they're not buying books, though?
Because I've tried to sell them
I think
we've
that-
tried to sell them.
Literary community always buy books.
No, even books by their own, even
Oh,
by their
okay.
own slam poets, they don't
Yeah.
buy the books.
It seems like there's a lack of passion for the word itself. And if somebody is genuinely interested, they're going to cultivate themselves. They're going to be, I have been to a few of your poetry slams and specifically went to speak to the audience about periods in history of poetry, who were some of the greats, and nobody could give me any answers. Usually, the answer you usually get is, I like everything, and that goes for music too. Oh, what do you listen to? I listen to everything. Oh, you do? Like what? Oh, if it's on the radio, I enjoy it. Or I like rock. Oh, well, who do you like? Rock. If it's on, I won't turn it off. So they don't have any points of reference. They're not cultivated, and that's what I'm talking about.
But I think we have to realize that spoken word, even though it's steeped in history, its modern form as slam poetry is very young. And so they don't have a lot of reference points to go back to if they were grown up in a spoken word community, if the community of slam poetry was the one that they were born into and kind of cultivated them.
No, by going back to the greats, that's what's going to strengthen them. That's where it's at.
Oh, I totally
That's what I'm
agree.
saying.
It's just that they don't
Yeah.
always have that access that
That's what I'm saying,
you
the
and me
points-
might have had.
I'm completely self-cultivated. When I was 16, actually, one of the most important days of my life, I skipped school and went to the library as usual. And upon a table, pretty much changed my life forever. There were 3 books. There was a dictionary of symbols by C.E. Surlott, Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, and a Carl Jung biography. And those changed, but you have to be, like I say, in love with the word. And you're going to, if you're really interested in poetry for real, and not just as an exhibition and a flailing of your emotions, then you'll get serious. There's a lot of serious issues that need to be dealt with in a metaphorical context today, because one's perception of reality is dependent upon your comprehension of language. Once again, your perception of reality is dependent upon your comprehension of language. So, I don't speak Japanese. If I was to go to Japan, I would have difficulty finding my way around because I wouldn't be able to read the signs. The same thing applies to language, and it's like, if you live in your neighborhood, you know the street signs, you know your way around. And it's the same as writing poetry and using language. You know your way around, you know where you're going. You can do it almost blindfolded, but you have to cultivate yourself and experience it.
But I would argue that that is endemic in all poetry communities and not
Yeah, no,
as
I do
simply
agree with you.
a
Like I
spoken word.
said, earlier as well, I find that some of the things that are symptomatic with, and it's symptomatic, not systematic, that I think that symptomatic with the poetry readings, I also see, or pardon me, in the poetry readings, I also see in the slams as
Right.
well.
Or-
Like I think
or
it's
literary.
it's viral. It's infecting all of language. Language is infected for sure.
Okay, this is Nick Beat, and this is Howl, of course, and we're having a panel discussion. For those who have just joined us, I'm with panelists Luciano, Iacobelli, and of course Madison Shadwell, and my good friend Dave Silverberg, and we are here discussing a central point, which is do poetry slams hurt or help poetry? We have a caller.
Of poets going to slams and slam artists going to poetry readings. I think there's a bit of a crossover, but part of the problem is once again the lack of points of reference and cultivation and a willingness to open up and listen to somebody else and perhaps even take a critique without being defensive. And more than just a boo or a hiss, but an actual, genuine, authentic, well-articulated critique. And the problem with today's society also is that clarity can come off as aggressiveness. So if somebody speaks with clarity and elegance, a lot of people perceive that as aggressive. And I mean, that's how far down, how degraded language has become.
Dave?
I think I'll go back to what Luciano said, is that there's going to be a lot of drivel of poetry slams. There's going to be a lot of poets that taint the experience that Madison might have experienced at a poetry slam, but the great poets, and maybe they don't always go to poetry slams, whether they're spoken word or otherwise, are ones that do take words into careful consideration, who elevate their talent, who have that curiosity to learn more about poetry than just beyond the spoken word artists among them, and you just have to dig to find them out. It's easy to kind of paint everything with a broad brush, and I've committed the same foul many times with the literary community, but I've learned that it's as multifaceted as any community in the art scene in Toronto, and that you have to do a bit of work to find the artists that resonate with you and that you feel accomplish and give honor to the art of word. And I can rattle off some names here, but I think it's worth it for a lot of people out there interested in spoken word or a literary poetry to put some work into finding the artists and the scenes that they feel very comfortable with.
Banu, thanks so much for calling in. Really appreciate your phone call and and what you were saying. Thank you, Banu, very much. Okay, take care. This is Nick Beat on CIUT's Howl. Hope you're enjoying our discussion. In about 5 minutes, we're going to take another musical break, and then I'll be back with all my announcements. There's like a ton of them, and some stuff that I'm doing this week actually, and performing.
So,
I think that another way to rephrase the question is slam poetry taking us one step backwards rather than forward in terms of the craft of poetry, and sometimes it does take us backwards. If an audience member is hooked on slam poetry and thinks that poetry is all about gushing it out, outpouring, all about putting your feelings down, politically correct sentiments, saying them loudly, saying them theatrically, if they think that is a poetic engagement, then they're wrong. That is not the true poetic engagement.
I think it's fair to say that's one type of poetic engagement.
But
it doesn't-
do those people stay there? That's the question. Do they ever go beyond that point? Do they ever say, you know what, maybe it isn't this, maybe there's more, maybe, let me explore where else language has been.
Stefan
That's where the
Mallarmé,
college.
Baudelaire,
Yeah, but
Rimbaud,
my
Eliot.
fear, Dave, is that they stay there.
I-
That they're exposed to that, and that is where they remain.
Just one quick example, there's a poet in our scene named Lara Bozabalian who
Right.
came to poetry from a literary perspective. She was quite involved with educating youth as a high school teacher, got into our scene from the literary community, was on our slam team for a couple of years, then returned back to the literary community to focus on publishing 2 books of poetry that on their own, whether performed on the stage or orally, are actually exquisite poetry, and a lot of our peers in both camps agree that Lara fits in both scenes and straddles both communities very smoothly. And she's not alone in terms of Canadian canon of being a kind of poet that finds value in spoken word, returns to something that is perhaps more traditional and built on the roots of poetry, and finding something that speaks to her. Perhaps one day she wants to do spoken word and she can, but then the other day she can submit a poem to Arc Magazine and validate herself in that kind of form.
But without the points of reference being, exhibited, without access to the points of reference, they're not going to be able to excavate,
Is there something about
I'd
the
like to-
slam structure that prevents growth? That's the question. Is there something about the whole format, the whole system of slam that doesn't encourage that moving forward, but
I think
encourages the there?
It's some of what you're talking about, the over-emotive expression gets in the way of language. The language should be doing that itself.
I'm
And
sorry.
that's why you move into theater.
I'm sorry.
It's kind of narcissistic. It's narcissistic. Yeah, glory. Yeah, narcissistic.
Sorry to cut India, Ivy. Thanks so much for calling in. Really appreciate your input, big time. By the way, in about 10 minutes, upcoming is Sex City on still so CIUT programming, so stay tuned for that. We got about 10 minutes left in our show. I think what I'm going to do is leave the music for the end of the show, and maybe do a few announcements just before I introduce the next song. This is by Arlene Paculin. We'll be playing that in about 5 minutes. Go ahead, Madison. You had
Okay,
a point to
well, before we close this evening, I'd like to read a poem for my muse, Nicoletta. It's entitled First Evening. I brought this poem to demonstrate some of my technique. It's a sonnet. It's heroic couplets, iambic pentameter, and the use of iambic pentameter is, of course, that the tidum 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 is
Like
the rhythm
verse.
of the heartbeat. It's the heartbeat. So this is a love poem. It's from the heart. The iambic pentameter, and then the heroic couplets in a sonnet form. First evening. Upon a bench before the moon-drenched haunt, an ideal hangout beauty to vaunt, courier of the drowsy messages, like walls of the permission vestiges, in a theta rhythm of desire, flames of dream choreography of fire. From her cinematic flares smoke spires, slow dance the dance of passion inspires, his lonely night. A sudden flare ignites, gray matter ticking sensual delights. The timing of a fluid thing, and all in all things exist as patterns football. To recall, if you believe in the muse, action at a distance, sparked like a fuse.